Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming to the Research Bureau's 24th annual meeting in this wonderful and historic hall. I'm delighted to see so many friends of the Research Bureau, and I'm really honored by your presence. This region has come through a very difficult year in which we have all been tested. An infestation of the Asian longhorn beetle and an unprecedented ice storm that has devastated our urban forest. A financial crisis of such proportions that no one has been left unscathed, not the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector, nor each of us personally. And it is clear that our travails are far from over. Although the Worcester City Council approved a balanced budget that is $14 million less than last year's, the state legislature's Senate Ways and Means Committee proposal calls for further cuts in state local assistance. If enacted, that will mean local aid from the state for municipal operations exclusive of the Worcester Public Schools will be cut by 43% for the next fiscal year. That translates into a loss of 440 positions, or 26% of the workforce. As bad as this sounds, the picture is by no means all doom and gloom. Without the strong leadership that has been exhibited in Worcester and many of the towns near here, the situation would be much worse. Let me mention a few of the positive developments that have occurred. City Manager O'Brien initiated a series of reforms in municipal employee health insurance 3 years ago, which has already saved taxpayers more than $45 million. He is developing partnerships with private institutions to supplement municipal services we can no longer afford. Two recent examples are the plans with UMass Memorial Healthcare to provide public health services and WPI's commitment to implement the Institute Park Master Plan. Our Public Works Department, under the able leadership of Commissioner Moylan, steered us through the winter's unusual and severe natural disasters. And thanks to our Congressman and Lieutenant Governor, the trees that had to be felled are being replanted. There are new jewels inside and outside City Hall. The Levi Lincoln Chamber has been lovingly restored to its late 19th century appearance as a public meeting room. And Worcester Common, which dates to the 17th century, has been restored for pedestrian use, and new public event space, which will double as an ice rink in winter, sits in anticipation of its first event. Buildings and storefronts are being renovated around the Common. The restored Hanover Theater completed its first successful season, and several new restaurants opened downtown in spite of the severe economic downturn. And the long-anticipated City Square project is expected to commence construction soon with the raising of the mall, thanks to the deal that has been struck between Unum, the first tenant and highly regarded Worcester company, and Berkeley Investments, the Boston-based developer. Our new superintendent of schools, Dr. Melinda Boone, starts work in her new position in less than a month, and her energy and ideas have already been felt. Her leadership in the cause of raising student achievement is welcome to develop an educated citizenry and workforce for this region. Our sincerest thanks to Dr. Deirdre Laughlin for providing a steady hand during this transitional year. Joint purchasing and sharing of services have become more common among towns in this region in order to provide more effective and efficient services. The Research Bureau is pleased to have played some part in these positive developments. As Chris Collins, the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Unum stated, quote, "The Research Bureau's fact-based analyses shed light on complex issues that affect the region's businesses and residents. Our suggested solutions to these issues are aimed at promoting a healthier, more prosperous climate for the region's citizens and business. I want to conclude by expressing my profound thanks to all the sponsors of this event and to all our supporters over the many years who believe in the Research Bureau's mission. My sincerest thanks to Commerce Bank, today's presenting sponsor, and to Brian Thompson, the bank's president and newly elected vice president for finance of the Research Bureau. Also, special thanks to Sovereign Bank for being today's leadership sponsor, and Jim Curran, the bank's senior vice president. I also want to thank Sandy Dunn for assuming the role of chairman of the board, and Agnes Cull for continuing as treasurer of the Research Bureau, and the other hardworking and enthusiastic volunteers who serve on the executive committee and the board. I would like to ask all board members to stand and be recognized at this point. And last but by no means least, my thanks to my very able staff members who do all the heavy lifting. Would you please stand and be recognized? Somewhere out there. I have two pleasant tasks left to perform today. One has to do with Brian Buckley. Brian, would you please come forward? Today marks the end of Brian's 2-year term as chairman of the Research Bureau Board of Directors. I am pleased to say that Brian has agreed to continue as a member of the executive committee. I'm sure he will serve as a very good mentor to Sandy Dunn, the Research Bureau's incoming chairman. Thank you, Brian, for all that you've done for the Research Bureau and for promoting us and for continuing to serve. And I also want to say that I've learned a great deal from you, including how to take your good-natured teasing.
Thank you.
Thank you. And at this time, I would like you to present you with the official Research Bureau chair so you can sit down and rest for the next 2 years.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gene wants a picture.
Oh, okay. Sitting there? Oh, okay. Got it?
Thank
Okay.
you. Just to the side.
Okay, all right. There is one other thing that I want. Some people may be wondering why this fellow is sitting here, aside from keeping me company on the stage. He has on a bow tie that belonged to Fair Cowan. And this is the first year that Fair is not with us. And I would like to call your attention to, in our annual report, to the tribute that I wrote for him and gave at his memorial service a number of months ago. So that's why he's kind of here, to keep us a little bit of company. His presence is very sorely missed, not by just the Research Bureau, but I think by the entire community. My final task is to introduce our featured speaker, a woman I have long admired, Amity Shlaes. Ms. Shlaes is a senior fellow in economic history at the Council on Foreign Relations, a syndicated columnist at Bloomberg, and the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. And you can all see on your tables that our centerpiece is a copy of her book. It was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books to read during a financial crisis. This book, about which she will speak today, has been widely praised by prominent figures such as George Will and Paul Volcker, and in publications such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Ms. Shlaes has written for the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, where she was an editorial board member, as well as for the New Yorker, Fortune, National Review, The New Republic, and Foreign Affairs. She has appeared on PBS's NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Comedy Central's The Daily Show, Fox News' Glenn Beck, ABC's Good Morning America, Charlie Rose, CNBC's Kudlow and Kramer. She also contributes to Public Radio International's Marketplace and appears frequently on Bloomberg Radio. In 2002, Ms. Schlase was co-winner of the Frederick Bastiat Prize, a new international prize for free market journalism. In 2003, she served as a J.P. Morgan Fellow for Economics and Finance at the American Academy in Berlin. She has twice been a finalist for the Loeb, business journalism's most prestigious prize. She is a graduate of Yale University and was named to its Who's Been Blue list of most distinguished alumni. In addition to her numerous professional accomplishments, Ms. Schlase is married to Seth Lipsky, a very successful journalist, and she's the mother of 4 children. Please join me in welcoming Amity Schlase.
Good afternoon. What a beautiful hall. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm working, you see the Forgotten Man book on your table, and right now I'm working on a new project, the graphic version, the cartoon version of the Forgotten Man book, which will feature real cartoon drawings and be about 140 pages. So I'm thinking graphically about this period now and that period then, the 1930s, how to render it all. One of the visuals I've been working the most with has been the Monopoly board. You may know that Monopoly was first introduced around Atlantic City, Philadelphia, in 1934, which would be a few years into the Depression, well after that '29 crash. And it sold very well. It sold so well that Parker Brothers bought it the next year in 1935. I'll read to you a sentence from the New York Times commenting on this new game and its power. Leading all other board games in the season's craze, Monopoly, the game of real estate. The fad in many cities seems to be gaining momentum. In cities smaller than New York, even small corner stores are selling these board games, Monopoly. Well, why were they playing the game? Or why do we know the game? We all know the principles of the game. It has the name Monopoly, so you sort of think a little bit about antitrust. But really, Monopoly is a game, as the Times said, about real estate or about property, the concept. In general, you're accumulating your hotels. Hopefully, you house, hotel one day, and you want to be reasonably sure of the value of the hotel, and you know the relationship of the hotel's value relative to the house. And you're familiar even with the tokens. You have the little dog, or you have the top hat, and you know that there's risk in the game, the chance cards. You know that tax, jail. They're there, but you also are aware of how often they occur, their relationship to the rest of the cards in the deck. And you know there's a bank. And let's face it, what makes us decide whether to stay at the Monopoly board or leave? It's the bank, right? If the bank is following the rules as in the guidebook or as the rules in your house where you play it, then you know what those rules are going to be. And you may not like every one of them, but at least they're predictable. That's a good bank. He's not too discretionary, or she. He's rules-based or wise or doesn't jump in too often. And what makes the game bad makes you want to walk away from the table. Well, that's the bank that intervenes too much, the bank that's unpredictable, the bank whose rules aren't anywhere. It's more about power and discretion. And whether you play depends on that. You spend a lot of time figuring out, is this bank too bad for me to stay? Or maybe it's just a little bad, so I'll stay even though he's a little bad because I want those hotels. And I think you can talk about 1920s history, 1930s history, our subject today, or our own experience now, trying to gauge when the recovery will come and of what quality the recovery will be in terms of monopoly. So I hope you'll indulge me while I walk through that for a few minutes. The 20s, the period, which is really the beginning of the Forgotten Man. The 20s were a good period, and they were a good period because they had a good bank. By the same token, the 30s were a bad period because they had a bad bank, and now our recovery is probably a bit challenged because we probably have what we would call a bad bank. I'm grateful to the Research Bureau, to Dr. Schaefer, whom I've known, though I just met for a while, to you all, to the bank, I think Mr. Thompson, the banks in the room, the literal banks for this opportunity. What do I mean when I say the 20s were a period of a good bank? We imagine the 20s maybe from the Great Gatsby movie or something, sort of a combo of fun and frivolity with some growth mixed in. Actually, the 20s were a very solid, great decade. And one reason they were great was this bank feature. The first factor was taxation. They're very reliable. We knew nationally that taxes were going in one direction, down, and that direction was going to stay that way the entire period. We had a Treasury Secretary who very clearly defined what the mission of the taxing authorities was to collect revenue. There was no social emphasis in the tax question. In fact, Mellon had a railroad metaphor that he used when he talked about tax. He said from his time in railroads, when you levy a tax, what rate do you set? You charge what the traffic will bear, not more, or the traffic will stay away. So it was a pragmatic form of taxation. And when it came to what you owed the government and what you didn't, and gray areas, there were fewer gray areas. You may know the quote from Judge Learned Hand, who talked about deductions, exemptions, different ways to pay less tax. And that is a famous quote which describes how they thought in the 1920s. Over and over again, courts have said there is nothing sinister in so arranging affairs as to keep tax as low as possible. Everyone does it, rich and poor alike, and all do right, for nobody owes any public duty to pay more than the law demands. Again, the rules. The second factor about the 20s was that if you were an employer and you felt the need to raise your labor price to pay more or to lower it, you had flexibility on that. You may know that there was a great panic in the early 20s where unemployment went up, at least for a month or two, above the 15% mark. What were employers able to do? They were able to pay less. It wasn't nice, it didn't make them happy, but they did, if you look at the data, significantly lower the pay that they paid, and that enabled them to keep more people. And the panic is remarkable also because it went away so fast. It's like a fever that's barely remembered. Within a year or two, unemployment was back down below 5%, which is also a level we used to expect just last year or two our unemployment to go back down to when things are good. When it came to regulation, the 20s also had a reliable authority, a reliable bank. There were the chance cards, the odd chance card. The one I think of where there was heavy and arbitrary regulation was, of course, prohibition. But you knew that if you weren't in the liquor business, you could steer clear of authorities on that, of the untouchables, of the whole Al Capone situation. So that was a choice. If you, in your business, chose not to incur the risks of the regulation of that area, you could achieve that. And in the other areas, as we know, the federal government was smaller than the states and towns. You could avoid regulation, or at least find regulation that was reliable in your area. Just the fourth feature of the 20s and what made them good and what made them such a good game involved people like you. Business leadership. There was a respect for business leadership and no mocking or ironic edge to it. In The Forgotten Man, I talk about two business heroes who did much for the economies of their states, of the country. The first is Sam Insull, who was the electrifier of Chicago. He started out with Tom Edison in the New York area, and he had an insight, which is that the Wall Streeters thought every man should have his own generator, just like every man has his own yacht. It was a sign of your greatness, and Insull said, no, we somehow can rationalize this, let's have a central generating station. And he was unable to get that money with Edison from Wall Street, and therefore ventured out to Chicago long before the 20s to try out his principle. LaSalle Street was friendly where Wall Street had not been, And he wired Chicago and created the format for the modern grid, and was much honored also in the UK, where he was born, for this early grid work. He built the Opera House in Chicago, shaped like an armchair. It was a big achievement, like this structure, for the town. And one reason it's shaped like an armchair is he quite rationally said, if I put commercial real estate upstairs, that revenue will subsidize the Opera House downstairs. And people said he built it like an armchair so that it could be a throne for his wife, who was on the stage, and that was also true. He loved his wife very much. But there was yet another reason he made the Opera House in Chicago like an armchair, which is that he could then make it face west with its back to New York, telling New York, I didn't need you, I face opportunity, you are all closed. So it was a very lovely, important building with pretty good acoustics, maybe not as good as this room, but right up there, and is there to this day. Insull was lionized in Chicago. He created many utilities companies. I was speaking with Mrs. Cull at lunch, and the way he did it was through stock, so he made company upon company, but it was a deflationary period, and you can see that in his leverage he was perhaps unwise, but also optimistic and simply collecting cash in equity because he could not get it from the bond market. The other was Mellon, the man I mentioned before, the Treasury Secretary, who had a great career in Wall Street. Mellon, of course, and in his empire from Pittsburgh, before coming to Washington to serve. Mellon was a star in the firmament. He was like Greenspan, only more. He was a Treasury Secretary so great it was said of him that 3 presidents served under him. And you want to imagine him setting that tax rate, saying his philosophy, always bringing the tax rate down, and the rate was higher than we know now, much higher. In World War I, it was 60s, 70s, 80s, a very high income tax. And they pulled it down, all the way down by stair steps, so that at its culmination under Mellon, the top rate was 25 for the income tax. So early Reagan, before Reagan, got it down to 24 for a minute, but I don't count that. Let's just say 25. And he was very much loved by Americans, even those who were not Republicans, as he was, and by his presidents. What about the 30s and the monopoly situation? Well, the crash comes. All presidents are compelled, all people are compelled. We know that unemployment was simply terrible. What we have now is a little rainstorm compared to the Katrina of unemployment that was the early Depression, with 1 in 4 unemployed. And as a result of crisis, the role of the bank changed. You can think of 3 or 4 ways in which this happened. Suddenly, the bank got a lot more active and a lot more unpredictable. So if you look at the pattern of taxation, the first area I mentioned, well, those rates went up, and for the same reason that rates are going up now. You have, oh my goodness, we need the revenue, these shortfalls that the city managers, the mayors, the governments, the states, there were tax strikes in Chicago, for example, of Insull. Well, we need to raise the rates. We don't like to. Even Mellon raised the rates with very much chagrin, but he did. Beyond that, the rates going up, you see them going back to those World War I levels. If you have a chart of the tax rate, you see it going from 25 all the way to 90 under Roosevelt, the top rate, was a change in the culture of what is tax. Roosevelt believed, and Hoover did not, I think, but Roosevelt definitely believed, and he came in, as you know, in 1933, that taxes were for revenge. So there was a problem with the class that was wealthy. Maybe they were too big, antitrust, monopoly. Maybe they were wrong. But in any case, there was political utility in attacking them. Anyway, that's what the Treasury and the Bureau of Internal Revenue, which is the forerunner to the IRS, were for in his emotional calculus. So he said, let's get them. Maybe it was also for helping the economy, sort of proto-Keynesian, the beginning of Keynes. Something about taxes will make the economy worse or better. So they began to be very vague, no more Learned Hand. Learned Hand actually uttered that phrase I read to you, very clear about what is legal in terms of deductions and whatnot in the 30s, but Roosevelt was already pushing him aside through effective policy at the Treasury and Bureau of Internal Revenue. Oh, we don't see any difference anymore between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Well, you're a bad person if you don't pay a lot of tax, especially if you're rich, and we're going to get you for that, and we will read your name over the radio. Is they did not have all the confidentiality rules that we have now if we feel like it, even if you are our cousin. So that was emanating from the Treasury of Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, and also at the same time, given the shortage of money, what do? You see in the paper now doubling of enforcement, lots more enforcement to close the so-called tax gap, and quite arbitrary. You have, in addition, the creation of taxes out of revenge, just as now when companies say, well, I don't want to spend this year, maybe I won't spend this year, maybe I'll invest in my company, but I'm not going to spend, I'll hold off. This made the government cross. The government wanted the companies to spend to get the economy going. The exact same phrase, if only they'd spend, then the economy would get like a car, and all these metaphors. The companies didn't want to spend, so what did Washington do to punish the businesses and force them to spend? They created an undistributed profits tax. So you want to say that phrase to yourself a few times, undistributed profits tax, because it's so creepy. What it is a tax upon the essence of a business. After the initial rate they set was 70%, you pay that for a couple of years, you don't exist anymore. Eventually, through a lot of negotiation, that rate was lowered, but you imagine what a mood that created in the entrepreneurial classes of the United States to know you'd be taxed for sitting still, even if you had no or less income than you expected, no income or less. Then to the second issue of the 20s, you remember I said the labor price was fairly free. If you wanted to raise it or lower it, you could in response to business conditions. That was over first under Hoover. One of the first things and most destructive things Hoover did, and if you really want to see the scholarship on this, I would commend a professor named Ohanian at UCLA and his partner named Cole at Penn. They are doing it. As soon as the Depression happened, Hoover called everyone to Washington, business leaders, including from Mass, and said, please don't lower wages or lay people off, because you want to get, again, that metaphor, the engine of the economy going again, spend, let the worker spend, and he'll buy cars again. And you see some rigidity then in the labor price in the early 30s, and you see them not laying off when they wanted to. But what was the net? They ended up shutting down. Rather than lower their pay, they had to shut down. The president had left them no choice through his very serious moral suasion. Roosevelt comes in and doesn't just use suasion, he uses law. So we had the National Recovery Administration, the centerpiece of the New Deal, which had effective minimum wages at a time when this, needless to say, was so hard to afford for companies. And in The Forgotten Man, I talk about one company that was very much hurt by this and went to the Supreme Court, the Schechter poultry business. They had to charge low prices to draw customers, and they had to pay relatively low wages to sustain their competitiveness against larger firms, monopolies or would-be monopolies in the chicken business, the kosher chicken business, wholesale. So subsequent to the National Recovery Administration, which the court sided with the Schechters, was overturned, we again institutionalized minimum wage, or high wages generally, I should say, not minimum wage, high wages generally through the Wagner Act, which you know, our original labor law. And later came also minimum wages over time and so on. So when you look at that period, you see people wanting to pay less and not able to, not because they were cruel, but because of the duration of the Depression. Regulation, extremely large. As you know, the Securities and Exchange Commission is created in this period, not clear exactly what its mandate is. This is a good thing when it comes to transparency, clarity. It says something nice about the relative competitiveness of U.S. markets. It says, here are the rules in the U.S., you can come play here and trade here. But it also, the SEC from the beginning had a very arbitrary aspect. It's up to the SEC what it chooses to investigate and how. A very aggressive bank indeed. I'll read you one quote about this from a commentator about just sort of businesses anxiety over the whole situation. There was a sense of cynicism and mirth after a while. It was so bad, changes coming from all directions. In one case, in 1937, an agent of the commission, that would be the SEC, visited the executor of a large estate to inquire why he'd sold $250,000 worth of securities in a single morning. The agent was informed the executor was selling to get cash with which to pay the United States estate tax. Catch-22, the moment when you feel, well, maybe I'll walk away from this monopoly board. Finally, the fourth component is the scapegoating of the old leaders of whom I spoke. Insull did overly leverage his companies. His thousands and thousands of shareholders lost most of their money, if not all. But it was terrible. It was a loss for many Chicagoans, but many Chicagoans still had faith that he would make money. Again, a rogue figure, an inspiring figure, somewhere in that gray area between someone we think is perfect and someone we don't approve of. That was Insull, with a lot of energy and very much loved. Did he have a chance to redeem his name by making profitable companies again with new innovations? He did not, because he was in court from about 1932 until he died, being prosecuted nominally for mail fraud and so on, but really as scapegoat of the failure of the 1920s. What happened to Mellon, the old Greenspan, the former Treasury Secretary, the Republican? He's in court again until he dies. What are the reasons? Nominal. Antitrust tax. It was particularly vindictive of the Treasury to go after the former Treasury Secretary for tax evasion, or whatever they called it. As I said, they conflated it. He was exonerated over and over again. Both men were. Did the prosecutions ever stop? They did not. So you have a sense, we're going to pound home that the economy's terrible, and we're going to do it through these people. And the greatest moment for Mellon really was on his 80th birthday when he was in court. And you know, the administration at that point had a stake in saying, we're in a permanent economic crisis. The reporters come up to him, and he's in court, and he's 80, and his life isn't turning out the way he thought it would be, so they're expecting maybe something sad. Also, it's 36 or 37, 7 years into the Great Depression, might be forever. And they said, Mr. Mellon, say a quote, your 80th birthday. And Mellon said, I want to tell you something. He smoked little black cigars. So imagine him smoking the cigar. He said, this depression, or this moment, is just a bad quarter hour in the glorious history of American growth. And that was the biggest diss that he could do. What he was saying was, your premise that you have always emergency, so you always need a big bank to run the monopoly board is off. Actually, the economy could recover. But he was in court until he died, which was soon after that. And if you go back and read the comments of the people in the period, they knew all this. They knew that they didn't want to play the game. I like the quote from Lamont DuPont, because it sounds like now, from the industrialists. Uncertainty rules the tax situation, the labor situation, the monetary situation, practically every legal situation under which industry must operate. Or, as in Monopoly, a great many men, this was the chief economist of Chase wrote this in his diary, which was published, his newsletter, a great many men simply withdrew from the market rather than have the details of their transactions thus inquired into by government. And we've all had that experience. Should I do this? It's going to be audited. Is it worth it? Maybe I won't do it. Looking at it, and the period I'm speaking of especially is 35 to 40, which I would call the unnecessary part of the Depression. And face it, after all, we wouldn't remember it the way we do if it had lasted 3 years and not 9, right? So that period where you have a calculus of frustration of the always recovering but never recovered economy. Observing what the U.S. was doing, the economist John Maynard Keynes from the U.K., and I know Dr. Schaefer herself has done some work on this, was commenting on the prosecutions of people like Mellon or Insull, but specifically on utilities, because the administration loved to torture utilities episodically. So Keynes wrote to Roosevelt about utilities. This is a very funny quote. Either nationalize them or leave them alone. What's the use of chasing them around the lot every other week? We all have a business experience like that, where we're sort of paid attention to, audited episodically now and then, and it seems so random. Or also Keynes said, and that's quite germane to this group, it is a mistake to think businessmen are any worse than government officials. So the consequences, you may know, we have a rally. There were rallies all the time in the 1930s. There was a lot of good in the 1930s and in the New Deal. But it was that calculus of frustration, the always recovering but never recovered economy, and the data are annihilating. If you just look at the data, look at the Dow. When did it started to come back, came back some of the way, it crashes. When did it crash? It crashed about when Mellon died at his daughter's house in Southampton on Long Island on Gin Lane, summer of 1937. Why? A lot of reasons, many monetary, but also because the star in the firmament, the old Greenspan, the old bank, the good bank, was gone and would clearly now never come back. August 1937, if you look at a chart. And indeed, overall, the Dow did not come back till the mid-50s. So that would be the equivalent of our Dow not coming back until 2032, 2033, 2034, which is not a prospect we find a term we find acceptable. Other meters, unemployment, if you use the government data that Dr. Romer uses at the Council of Economic Advisors, you see an average of unemployment in the 1930s above 15%, maybe 16%. If you use more charitable data that includes some of the more make-work jobs of the New Deal, 3-month jobs, 6-month jobs, well, you get unemployment to an average of 14% for the 1930s, also nothing that our politicians or we would find in the least acceptable. We like to use GDP per capita to measure how the country's doing. Does it come back? It does not come back until 1939. So you want to be fussy and have monetary in there. We'll do real GDP per capita. It does not come back until 1939 or so. It's an annihilating result and nothing we would ever want to be repeating. So what about today? Why did I even mention this whole story? Aside from having written on it, what relevance do I see? Quite a bit in terms of the Monopoly Board, in terms of those areas I mentioned before for the 20s and 30s. Taxes, do we have good news? We don't. First, we have the bad news of the rates going up. That's one factor, but we also have secondarily a certain unreliability to the future of taxation. It's awfully arbitrary. We don't know whether we'll get a value-added tax. Perhaps you've heard talk of that in Washington. How the tax will be formatted. I visited with some people on the Hill this week, and what they said was, we're going to get a tax, something tax is going to happen this year, and it'll be bad, and it'll probably be part of the healthcare legislation. I said, well, why is that? Well, they have to work on the healthcare legislation, so they'll throw in whatever it is, maybe an end to deferral for in terms of overseas, something big that matters a lot to the economy in with a piece of legislation that has at least nominally little to do with tax. That's awfully unpredictable. That's a bank who's not throwing out cards you're not expecting. And if you want to go through the rates you know are going up, it's a sort of a story of horror. One that I will mention that barely gets discussed and will clearly for sure go up is that the payroll tax cap, which currently starts at about $100,000, $110,000. After that point, you cease to pay Social Security, and your employer likewise. That's going to blow, just as you may recall it did blow with Medicare in 1993. That's a huge tax increase all by itself. That undoes a lot of Bush. And then on top of that, the income tax and all the other taxes. I mentioned estate tax before that will go up, corporate taxes. Labor price, are we giving freedom to the players to make decisions about labor price that they need to make in this hard time? Not always. You see union legislation, but of course you also see card check. But you also see the Buy America provision. Protectionism protects wages at a time when some of us can't afford the wages that are going to be demanded. In its way, the deals with Detroit, in their way, are wage protection. It's not pretty, the kind of wages that will come out after this downturn, but Mellon was right. If the market clears, you get to recovery faster. I think in terms of rehiring, and we're talking now about rehiring, at what moment do I choose to come back to the Monopoly Board and rehire? What's keeping me from coming back to the board? It's healthcare. Who wants to ever create a job again with healthcare? No one. I mean, I don't know about this room. It's so hard to do. You want to do it emotionally, socially, but the prospect of the costs with no cap is preventing rehiring, which is why our recovery will not be like that of 1920-21, where all of a sudden we can blink and pretend it didn't happen and unemployment is below 5%. I heard someone say that the new rate, the new set rate, won't be below 5. It'll be more like 7, more like we're used to having back 20 or 30 years ago. A regulation, it's quite arbitrary. A good SEC law would be one that, new reform law would be one with rules. We might not like all the rules, but at least rules. A bad one would be a very powerful discretionary SEC. The scapegoating, you want to recall the scapegoating of the New Deal happened 5 years in. So I don't think we've seen all the scapegoating yet, but the point is it is costly, it's unpredicted, it constrains our behavior. And AIG and the attention to AIG and driving around Greenwich photographing people's houses is just the beginning. In short, you want to ask yourself, you're trying to gauge, when is our recovery coming? Where is the recovery? And you have to just say, I'll know that by looking at how the bank is doing and how it's behaving. The story of the 30s was not a story of depression. It was a story of a recovery that chose to stay away. So that's what we're trying to do now, is to lure back recovery. How do we measure what I'm talking about? You noticed probably the market bounced around on consumer confidence data this week, last week. Consumer confidence is an overrated datum. It says, how do you feel about shopping tomorrow? So it treats people as moody lightweights. It doesn't really say, how do you feel about producing tomorrow, which is an enormously important component to every recovery. And I am pleased to say I came upon a datum recently that I love, and I'm trying to get the Bloomberg to give it marquee status. I receive no compensation from these scholars, but I want to talk about them as though I do, because they are so fabulous. They actually have used the monopoly metaphor themselves too. It's a guy named Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago Business School, that's now Booth School of Business, and a lady named Paola Sapienza of Northwestern Kellogg. And they said, we don't like that consumer confidence meter. It doesn't tell us about us, about what business, about what people in this room will do when they decide about their hiring plan or absence of one. We're going to make a new meter. We'll call it, and it's not going to be about confidence and mood. It's going to be about what we call trust. So they called it the Financial Trust Index. I call it the Chicago Trustometer. I also like the fact, again, that it's not New York, not Washington. The trustometer goes to households, but not as shoppers, not as mall rats, but goes to them rather as thinkers and creators, and says, what institutions in your life are there, and how do you feel about them? Let's ask you to measure how much you trust your local bank, the big bank far away, how much you trust the bond market, how much you trust the stock market, how much you trust, one of the things they've talked about at least is whether your contract will be honored, your monopoly houses will be worth something or not, how much do you trust government? They did 2 waves of this financial trust index, so it's very new, and they found in December that people didn't trust any of those institutions and related that to their decision to wait out investing in the stock market. Then they go to March and they ask again, so we have a new administration, and what you find, people still were not too happy with the inconsistency of the great monopoly bank, that is, of the new Obama administration either. Even Democrats in majority were not feeling they trusted the government yet. This is my recovery meter. This is what I'm going to follow. When the trust there is stronger, I'm going to forecast recovery, but it isn't yet, and I just offer it to you because I do believe it deserves to be popularized. What your research bureau does, what the NBER does, what all such town and city and state institutions do those things are so crucial to monitoring as well. And you're looking, what does my city feel like? Does it feel like investing again? That's important to the rest of us nationally. You're the watchdogs that watch the bank. So I even have an animal here, a dog-like figure to watch the bank, which is currently writ large, our government, the central bank, the Fed, the Treasury, and so on. And it's when you and people like those Chicago people tell us, oh yeah, we feel like investing again, that's when the recovery is going to come. And when you come back to the monopoly table. Thank you very much for hearing me out on this topic. Wave your hand, because I can see here close, but I can't see far very well. Oh yeah, there's a mic. Oh.
Thanks, Amity. I wanted to ask you what your response is to commentators who say that the reason that the New Deal failed in the end to curb unemployment was that Roosevelt became too conservative circa 1936, decided to be more fiscally responsible, raise taxes, no longer rely on Keynesian stimulus. In other words, according to this argument, which I think Paul Krugman, among others, has made, if only Roosevelt had stuck to his original outlook, unemployment wouldn't have returned.
It's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. Krugman is right that the federal government then spent less than the federal government now. So if you go look at Roosevelt at his height in 1936, running for re-election, boy, he expanded the government. They were spending far more than they'd ever imagined spending before. You'll see federal spending at about 9% of GDP, or 10% maybe, or 8% in that period. Well, even at rest under Ronald Reagan, we thought the federal government ought to be about 18% of GDP, and it was. We used to have charts at the Wall Street Journal where I worked, the 18% chart that showed federal spending was always about 18% of GDP, i.e. double that so-called stupendous New Deal. So in that fact, he's right. And it's also true that if you spend crazily, as we are doing now, and as the US did when World War II came along, you will get activity. It's like, I don't know the metaphor, a transfusion is probably the best one for a patient who has who's anemic. It comes to life, but doesn't cure the anemia. So we will come to life. We've come to life quite a bit since March in terms of the market, but what is the quality of what comes after when the transfusion ends? You usually have, the patient slips back, a terrible, wicked, or if you want to use a liquor metaphor, a great night, but a terrible morning after. It's a very Latin pattern. If you look at Latin governments over the years, they spend, and then stop. That's what, in the 1930s, I would argue that the spending was a component, the shifts in the monetary climate and spending was part of it, but this uncertainty feature, which I mentioned, was also, it was in my view, dispositive. And if you want to know like who's rebutting Krugman aside from Amity Shlaes, the economist who wrote the book, who told me what had happened, who was there, was Benjamin Anderson, the chief economist of Chase. And I read a couple of his quotes, but if you go back and read his diary, you don't hear about how much crying Wall Street is about the doubling of reserve requirements or the end of the veterans bonus or the other monetary restrictions that happened 36, 37. You hear about an environment that was terrifying to operate in because of the factors that I mentioned. So I would argue uncertainty was more important than monetary in the later half of the 30s. And there, likewise, it's important today. We want to be more certain so that we can play, and that will contribute to our economy coming back. Okay. Thank you very much. No, thank you.
Okay, with that, our 24th annual meeting of the Research Bureau comes to an end. See you at the 25th. Thank you very much. Have a good day.